who is really buried at Sutton Hoo? What if I told you that the most famous burial in British archaeology might have belonged to a one-eyed demigod fresh from an imperial war in Syria? This is Sutton Hoo, a site of kings, myths and mysteries. But despite the treasure, the helmet and the blockbuster Netflix film The Dig, we still don't know the name of the person who's buried there. So the question of who is actually in the tomb is a good one, but is it the right question to ask? Let's find out. Sutton Hoo. What is it? Where is it? When does it date back to? It's a burial site in Suffolk on a rise above the River Deben. There are about 18 burial mounds there, but the most famous one, Mound 1, was excavated in 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Inside, archaeologists found the ghostly imprint of a 27-metre-long ship, packed with treasure, gold, silver, weapons, feasting gear, and one very famous helmet. Sutton Hoo dates to the early 7th century, probably the 620s or just after. So that's the what, where and when, but the real question is, Sutton Hoo? Sadly, the clue isn't in the name. The Who bit of Sutton Hoo just means a spur of land. The site is in the care of the National Trust, and this year, 2025, they have an exhibition about the story of The Dig, the 2021 Netflix film that dramatised the original excavation, featuring some of the props and costumes. That film is a great watch, and it highlights the key thing about that 1939 excavation, which was that the finds were not designated as treasure trove, and so rather than belonging to the Crown, they were declared the property of a certain Mrs. Pretty, the landowner. And, in one of the greatest acts of archaeological altruism, Mrs. Pretty gifted the finds to the nation. The treasures are on display in the British Museum in London, but you'll also see replicas at Sutton Hoo. And of course, when the Bayeux Tapestry comes to Britain, the Sutton Hoo treasures are going to France. Now, let's laser in on Mound 1. There was the ship buried in its entirety, and at its centre was a burial chamber. It had a wooden coffin in the middle, where the mast ought to have been, and then all manner of fantastic goods around that. The accoutrements of a warrior, weapons, armour, a shield, and the helmet. Plus, there are items associated with feasting, a large bronze cauldron, and other bowls, cups, drinking horns, spoons, and money, a purse of 37 gold coins, which date to the late 6th and early 7th century. There are some items there that seem to reflect Christian views, the spoons and the coins, but a lot of martial material that feels suggestive of pre-Christian times. So this was a burial fit for a king, but shame there's no king's body to be found there. There aren't any actual human remains in the ship, because the acidic nature of the soils at the site means that organic matter has long since disappeared without a trace. We can be pretty sure that there was a body there though, and the standard theory is that this was the grave of Redwald, king of the East Angles. He ruled around the time the burial was made. He was powerful, well-connected, and famously hedged his religious bets by keeping altars to both Christ and the old gods. At least, that's what the later historian Bede tells us. For context, this was the period when Christianity was spreading through the land after the Augustinian mission of 597 AD. According to Professor Martin Carver, an archaeologist who has excavated extensively at Sutton Hoo and who joined me on the HistoryExtra podcast when the Dig film came out, the burial site is all about this dynasty trying to construct a pagan kingdom in imitation of Christian kingdoms over a period of half a century or so. Professor Carver interprets this as an investment by the dynasty in their continuity, and perhaps as a reaction to the spread of Christianity from the continent. A call, maybe, to the older gods for protection against that incoming threat. But what if there is another backstory to consider? Dr. Helen Gittos has recently suggested that the person buried might have been a Byzantine mercenary. That would explain the exotic mix of grave goods. including a silver dish made in Byzantium, a bowl, possibly from Egypt, and Frankish gold coins. I chatted to Dr. Gittos on the History Extra podcast, and she outlined her argument that soldiers were enlisted by the Roman Emperor in Byzantium to fight against the Sasanians in what is now Armenia and Syria as part of a major recruiting campaign in Western Europe in 575 AD. She proposes that these troops included men from Britain attracted by the allure of adventure and reward. So this was a Christian army fighting for the Byzantine Empire. Dr. Gittos argues that rare objects from the Eastern Mediterranean, including items found at Sutton Hoo, were likely acquired by recruited Anglo Saxon soldiers. Those who returned brought back with them goods which were fresh, current and distinctive, and unlike the type of objects traditionally found in normal trading networks. Soldiers get rich in war, so maybe whoever was buried in Sutton Hoo doesn't need to be a king, but rather could have been an adventurer coming home from active duty on the front and bringing back the spoils. One of the questions that we can't answer is how far the Sutton Hoo burial is actually unique. It's quite possible that there were more of these rich burials of homecoming soldiers that simply haven't survived or yet been found. Dr. Gittos's theory is also based on the wealth of another rich burial at Prittlewell in Essex, and there are other examples too, plus maybe more yet to be discovered. This is a reminder too that although we in Britain traditionally talk of an end to the Roman Empire and often see a clear fault line after it, actually the Eastern Roman Empire, from Byzantium, continued to exist and operate after the Western Empire had collapsed. This narrative from Dr. Gittos puts the people in Anglo-Saxon England back into this broader, continental Christian world. Old Rome to New Rome. That's food for thought. And how can I talk about Sutton Hoo without mentioning the helmet? Because that gives us another angle, which takes us from the eastern fringe of Europe to its northern edge. The helmet, possibly the most memorable object in British archaeology, was long thought to have been made in Sweden, though a recent discovery has suggested a Danish origin. It's made of iron, with tinned bronze panels stamped with a series of repeated designs, including mounted warriors, cloisonné garnets, and it has an extraordinary face mask, complete with eyebrows, moustache, and a nose that doubles as a dragon. What does cloisonné mean? It's a hard word to say to start with, but it's an ancient metalworking technique for decorating metalwork objects with coloured material held in place or separated by metal strips or wire, in this case setting the garnets amidst wafers of gold foil. The technique makes the garnets really shine, with carefully patterned foil to reflect light, and that makes the eyes glint red in the firelight. But here's the thing, only one eyebrow has the foil, the other doesn't. So in a darkened hall, lit only by firelight, the person wearing this would appear one-eyed. Professor Neil Price and Dr. Paul Mortimer have clocked this eyebrow omission and suggest it could have been deliberate, a way of evoking a non-Christian god, Odin, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, who we more normally associate with the Vikings. Was the wearer being presented as a godlike figure, someone harnessing the power of the one-eyed deity if you put the helmet on in a certain light? That would be a memorable sight, and one that would surely have evoked the northern pantheon of gods much more than the Christian one. So does that theory sit at odds with Dr. Gittos's Byzantine one? Perhaps, or maybe it just speaks to a more complicated, connected, and religiously dynamic world. Let's pull back for a moment, because maybe the question isn't who is buried at Sutton Hoo, but why was someone buried like this? Professor Howard Williams has argued that these mounds weren't just graves, they were monuments designed to manipulate memory, to create a link with the past, to anchor power in the landscape. And the burial itself, it might have been performative, a public spectacle, a display of wealth, power, and cultural identity at a time when Anglo-Saxon society was still defining itself. Professor Carver described an evocative scene to me of people walking around the burial chamber before it was covered with earth and engaging closely with the artefacts on display. I think that's a really interesting idea. We only see these archaeological sites at their endpoint, but we have to remember that they could have been created as much for the moment as for their long-term legacy. Remember, this was a few generations after the so-called Anglo Saxon migration. Britain had gone from Roman to post-Roman to something new. Sutton Hoo is part of that transformation. And then there's Beowulf. The great Old English epic opens with a ship burial. King sent out to sea, surrounded by treasure. Seamus Heaney's translation of the poem goes as follows. They stretched their beloved lord in his boat, laid out by the mast amidships, the great ring giver. Far-fetched treasures were piled upon him, and precious gear. Sounds familiar. It's tempting to read Sutton Hoo through the lens of Beowulf, or perhaps vice versa. Maybe the poem preserves memories of real funerals like this, or maybe Sutton Hoo was trying to bring myth to life. I've been to Sutton Hoo a few times, and for my money, it's a special place. Maybe that's just because we know what's there. But there is definitely something magical about standing on that ridge, looking out over the river, surrounded by those grassy barrows. Even if the original treasures are now in the British Museum, it still feels resonant. It's still a powerful sight. So, who is really buried at Sutton Hoo? A king, a mercenary, a one-eyed god, maybe all three, maybe none. Maybe the point wasn't the person at all, but the performance, the spectacle, the memory. Whoever they were, they left behind a story that still captivates us centuries later and keeps bringing up questions. That is the power of the place. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, who do you think was buried at Sutton Hoo? Or should we stop asking that question and focus on something else entirely?